save money, but at the risk of endangering the lives and the livelihoods of millions of people off of the coastline of our country. I urge an aye vote for the Markey Amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I would close by saying that the experts that we should rely on are those that are in the Department of the Interior, Director Michael Bromwich with BOMRA and all the way down, who have been working on this for the last year. They have extensive regulations. Some of what's proposed are actually regulations right now. And while the bill does call for certain safety standards to be satisfied and met, we have delegated the responsibility for the exact language and implementation of those regulations to those who deal with this 8 hours a day, day in and day out, week in, week out, year in and year out. So there is a balance. We give the broad parameters. They carry out, as a regulatory agency, every last final detail. And Congress, as has been admitted, does not have the technical expertise to foresee every single development and foresee every single problem that could arise. So while overseeing, we have to do some delegation. This bill does that. We strike that fine balance, and the administration's department has been doing a strong job of strengthening the safety requirements. I do take issue with the pace of their permitting, but as far as the safety implementation, they have put very aggressive safety measures into place. So for those reasons, Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. I would urge a no vote. I yield back the balance of my time.
His time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request the yeas and nays.
Does the gentleman ask for a recorded vote?
Yes, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts will be postponed.
It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part A of House Report 112-73. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I rise to address the amendment which is at the desk.
Does the gentlelady offer the amendment?
Yes, I offer the amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 4, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-73, offered by Ms. Hanabusa of Hawaii.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 245, the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will allow myself whatever time is necessary. Mr. Chair, the amendment that I propose is a very simple and a common sense amendment. What we have, first of all, let us recall where we come from. Title 43, Section 1340, entitled Geological and Geophysical Explorations, is what is the subject of H.R. 1229, specifically subsection D, entitled Drilling Permit. Under that subsection, the Secretary, it states the Secretary may, by regulation, require any lessee operating under an approved exploration plan to attain a permit to drilling any well in accordance with such plan. What the amendments are proposing here today, and what my amendment addresses, is what is set forth at page 4, and I propose that it amends after line 6 and includes a subsection 3, which addresses the worst-case discharge scenario certification. This amendment requires the Secretary that shall not issue a permit under paragraph 1 without certifying that the applicant first has calculated a worst-case discharge scenario for the proposed drilling operations, and B, has demonstrated to the satisfaction of the Secretary that the applicant possesses the capability and technology to respond immediately and effectively to such worst-case discharge scenario. Mr. Chair, we are talking here to the people across this nation and in the world who watch the worst-case scenario. What happened in the BP oil spill? What we are simply saying is that before any permit is issued, that the Secretary take the precaution of first having assessed what that worst-case scenario could be, and second, that whoever is seeking, that applicant who is seeking this permit, has both the capability and technology and has demonstrated as such to address that worst-case scenario. Mr. Chair, it is a simple statement, and it is a requirement that the people would like to see. No one wants to sit there and experience a BP oil spill again. Mr. Chair, I reserve the remainder of my time.
Reserves the remainder of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I do oppose this amendment because it is duplicative and unnecessary. This amendment attempts to expand upon the language in the bill that already mandates that the Secretary conduct a safety review to affirm oil spill response and containment capability prior to issuing a permit. We believe that the Department of the Interior already requires that applicants must calculate worst-case discharge before approving a permit. On June 18th of last year, the Department issued a notice to lessees outlining the information requirements and standards to be met before a permit could be approved. In the notice, it required that a lessee, quote, describe the assumption and calculations that you used to determine the volume of your worst-case discharge scenario, unquote. So this exact language, this exact intention has already been addressed, so I would oppose this amendment as redundant and unnecessary. At this point, Mr. Chairman, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlelady from Hawaii.
Mr. Chair, I allow myself a minute of my
Gentlelady is
reserved
recognized
time.
for 1 minute.
Mr. Chair, if this amendment is duplicative, and it should not be an issue, because what it does do is it contains the language that the people want to hear. The people want to hear what is the worst-case scenario. I also contend that it really doesn't do that. It is not duplicative. What contained in the bill is the statement, a critical safety system requirement, including blowout prevention, and oil spill response and contamination requirements. It does not say the worst-case scenario, and it does not require the applicant to show the Secretary that it has the capability and the technological ability to address that. So it is not duplicative. But to the extent that the opposer would like to say that it is duplicative, then I believe that they should not object to this, because after all, it does say what people want to hear. People want to be guaranteed that the BP oil spill does not happen again. I reserve the remainder of my time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield 2 minutes to a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee who has a district in the state of Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rarely are the goals of our country as aligned as they are now. Clearly, we need economic recovery with good jobs, with good benefits for those who, frankly, right now have a problem with unemployment. As it turns out, we also have the goal of increasing our energy security, and lastly, a goal of protecting our environment. Now, let's just go through these in order. As regards jobs, let's just talk about the oil and gas industry. The President, the administration's estimates of the economic impact of the moratorium and the permitatorium are hundreds of thousands of jobs lost and about $2.5 billion in lost economic activity. Now, this is not just the Gulf Coast, and it's not just the oil rig workers. It's also those who work on pipelines. It is boat builders. Indeed, as it turns out, one of the boat builders in Louisiana is the largest customer worldwide of Caterpillar engines. An engine that is built in the state of Illinois using steel from the Midwest is used on the coast of Louisiana to build boats to service those rigs. Needless to say, those Caterpillar engines are not now being ordered. That steel order going to Caterpillar to build these is not being done. So the jobs that ripple out are not just in the Gulf Coast, but go all the way across the country. We also have a goal to increase our energy security. Prior to Macondo, 1/3 of the domestically produced oil in the United States came from the Outer Continental Shelf. Since we have limited further exploration, we've lost that potential to increase our domestic supply of energy to increase our security, to insulate us, if you will, from those issues in North Africa which are currently driving up our fuel prices. And lastly, we have a goal to protect our environment. Oh, we all care about that. In Louisiana, we particularly care about that. We do not take this for granted. But in Louisiana, we realize you have to be both pro-business as well as pro-environment. And we take that very seriously. So what are the facts on this? The President, right after the Macondo spill, appointed a Blue Ribbon Commission from the National Academy of Engineering. These engineers that the President picked said that the causes of the oil spill are identifiable and correctable, and that a prolonged moratorium will not appreciably improve safety.
I yield an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
So what we've seen since, though, is not a recognition that the President's Blue Ribbon Commission is right, but rather a regulatory hurdle set upon regulatory hurdle set upon regulatory hurdle. Now we have a notice to lessees which demands that which this amendment also demands, and so we're going to have not just a notice to lessees, but we're going to have this amendment on top of it. At some point, your hostility to an industry becomes hostility to workers, becomes hostility to our energy security, and frankly becomes an hostility to our environment. I oppose this amendment. I think it's bad for our workers, I think it's bad for our economy, and I think it's bad for our environment. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Hawaii.
May I inquire of the chair as to how much time is remaining on both sides?
Gentlelady from Hawaii has 1 minute and 3/4. The gentleman from Colorado has 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself a minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm sure that the gentleman from Louisiana had no intention of saying that anyone who may want an amendment to this bill is somehow hostile or somehow anti-jobs, anti-energy security, and anti-environment, because those are not the intent. This bill has been labeled Putting the Gulf of Mexico Back to Work Act. We have no objections to that, Mr. Chair. But why can't it also say Putting the Gulf of Mexico Back to Work Act safely? And that's all that's being requested here. Let's look at what happened at the BP oil spill. Let's just make sure that it does not happen again. Another spill like that, by taking these precautions, can be avoided. And by doing that, we will not be faced with a situation where someone from that district would say we're hostile because we're not encouraging jobs or not encouraging energy security or not encouraging the environment. This is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to do all of these, and it has a ripple effect throughout the nation. Thank you. I reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I have no other speakers, so at this point I'm going to wait and close as soon as the gentlelady is done.
Does the gentleman reserve his time?
Yes.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlelady from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I request an aye vote on this amendment. It is a very straightforward, commonsensical amendment. It addresses what the people want to hear and want to know, that we are ready to address the worst-case scenario, and the Secretary will not issue a permit until it is addressed. It is not only identified, but that the applicant has both the technological skills plus the capabilities to do and to prevent such a spill. We are all interested in the jobs and the economic security of the Gulf and all the neighboring states in that area, plus its ripple effect. That is why we want to see that it never happens again, and that is why we want the people to be confident that we in Congress have addressed their concerns. Thank you, and I request an aye vote. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will close by saying that this amendment, though well-intended, is duplicative, and I think that's been admitted by the other side, and therefore is unnecessary, and I would urge a no vote. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Hawaii. Those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Those opposed by saying no. In the opinion of the chairs, the no have it, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Hawaii will be postponed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The chair understands that amendment number 5 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in Part A of House Report 112-73. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I have Amendment Number 6 at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 6, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-73, offered by Mr. Holt of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 245, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
I thank the Chair. H.R. 1229 includes language that would add a timeline to the permitting process for offshore oil and gas drilling. This provision states that, quote, if the Secretary has not made a decision on the application by the end of the 60-day period beginning on the date the application is received by the Secretary, the application is deemed approved, end quote. My amendment would simply strike this section. In other words, as it stands in the legislation before us, if for whatever reason, incomplete information, new information, the Secretary has not made a decision whether or not to approve the application, then the application will be considered from then on approved. There are a number of provisions in this bill that could make offshore drilling less safe. My amendment is aimed at perhaps the most dangerous of those provisions. This bill short-circuits existing requirements to protect oil industry workers and those who depend on marine resources for their livelihoods and so forth. Ensuring that environmental and safety standards are met so that the new permits will not result in a repeat of the Deepwater Horizon disaster is really too important to allow permits to go through the door prematurely and automatically simply because of an arbitrary timeline imposed by this legislation. Depending on the dedication of a particular secretary to safety and environmental protection, H.R. 1229 would produce either precipitous automatic approval of an application to drill or unjustified rejection of a valid application if the review is not completed within the allotted time. Either way, the imposition of an arbitrary deadline is bad policy. It's based on a presumption that environmental and safety reviews are worthless and that there is really no value in getting the review right. My amendment would leave in place the permitting timeline set in H.R. 1229, creating the sense of urgency my colleagues are seeking, but it would remove the automatic approval of drilling applications after that 60-day timeline. If we've learned anything from the Deepwater Horizon disaster, it is that we must do more, not less, to protect those who work in the oil industry and those who depend on offshore resources and onshore resources for their livelihood. I urge my colleague to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume. The legislation on the floor today is designed to put Americans in the Gulf region back to work and to ensure that permits are processed in a timely fashion and that bureaucratic delays are not hampering the nation's energy production. There are critics of the timeline that is proposed in this bill on both sides of that timeline. Some say it's too short. Others say it is too long. It's important that people understand that nowhere in this bill do we require the administration to do anything but reach a decision, whatever that decision might be. They may deny an application at any time in the process as long as they provide a clear description of why they are doing so. Prior to the incident in the Gulf, the administration was very capable of processing permits in 5 to 15 days on average. The 30-day timeline in the bill is significantly longer and allows the administration extensions. In the end, the administration must reach a decision. The provision this amendment proposes to remove is the final deadline that the administration must meet, and one that should be firm to ensure that decisions are made in a timely manner and that no de facto moratorium or permitorium is instituted. This amendment, if adopted, would simply further delay offshore energy production. It would continue to allow the Department to arbitrarily impose a de facto drilling moratorium that could cost thousands of jobs and allow higher prices on energy with less supply. I oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote no, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New Jersey.
May I ask the chair the time remaining?
Both sides have 3 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chair, my friend from Colorado talked about the harm that this bill would do and why it's important that the application be approved even if the review is not complete, even if the review is not yet done right. I wonder if the gentleman from Colorado thinks that maybe a student should graduate, even if he hasn't taken the exam, because the semester is coming to an end. And, well, time's up. I guess we should just declare the student duly passed, even if the review hasn't been done. That's a question. If the gentleman feels that a student should be deemed passed because the semester is coming to an end, even if the review of that student's work has not been completed.
Is the chairman...
Maybe I would yield to the gentleman if he cares to answer that. If not, I will continue. I guess not. You know, this legislation might make sense if we thought there was some economic need for it, if we thought that there was some safety need for it, if we thought it was important to grease the skids and move through the environmental review quickly. But none of those things apply. This will not bring down prices. Certainly, release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve would do more for prices at the pump than this. This won't make a mill of a difference in the price at the pump, this legislation. It certainly won't help support an important but troubled industry. This industry is not troubled. This industry is going to take home about $100 billion in profits this year. We don't need to grease the skids and make things easier for this industry because getting the review right would subject them to undue hardship. No, in fact, this is a very dangerous provision in a bill that is part of the set of amnesia acts. The bill is part of these three bills that pretend that there were no lessons to be learned from 2010. The bill that pretends the Gulf oil blowout never occurred, that wills amnesia on the policy of the United States so that we forget that the worst oil spill in history, from which there are real lessons to be learned, never occurred. I urge passage of this amendment.
Does the gentleman yield back?
I yield back the balance of my
The gentleman
time.
yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to apologize. I was confused as to whether you were asking a rhetorical question or really wanted to have a colloquy. By the time I figured that out, you had moved on to the remainder of your argument. So I was happy to, and hopefully in the future could have a colloquy on that with you. At this point, Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Landry.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 1 minute.
The gentleman must not understand that he wants to reinstate the de facto moratorium that is plaguing the Gulf of Mexico with this amendment. It is exactly what he's trying to put in place, which has allowed the administration to drag its feet not only on the wells, on the drilling on the shelf, but also, in deep water, but also in the shelf as well. He must also be confused because you see what the Democrats have proposed, what the other side has proposed in removing the tax breaks for these companies would make oil and gas, the Congressional Research Service has reported, that proposal would also make oil and natural gas more expensive for the U.S. consumers and likely increase our foreign independence. Now, what are we here to do today? We're here to bring relief to Americans at the pump and get the Gulf of Mexico back to work. I yield back the balance of my time.
Johnny's back. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will conclude by saying that what this bill wants to accomplish is that the administration must reach a decision on whether a permit should be issued. This amendment proposes to remove the final deadline that the administration would have to meet, and one that should be firm to ensure that decisions are made in a timely manner and that no de facto moratorium is instituted. This amendment would simply further delay offshore energy production. That does not help jobs, it does not help the supply or cost of energy in this country. It would allow the Department to arbitrarily impose a de facto drilling moratorium that would cost thousands of jobs. I oppose this amendment. I urge my colleagues to vote no. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that I ask a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in Part A of House Report 112-73. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 7, printed in Part A of House Report number 112-73, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 245, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to submit my entire statement to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1229 would impose an artificial and arbitrary 30-day deadline with extensions for a total of 60 maximum days for Interior Department action on drilling permit applications. If at the end of the 30 to 60-day period, Interior hasn't acted by approving or disapproving the permit is, quote-unquote, deemed approved automatically, even if the environmental and safety review process haven't been completed. If the Secretary decides that the agency hasn't had enough time to approve the permit, then his only choice is to deny the permit, undoubtedly leading to additional lawsuits from companies. Mr. Speaker, this legislation doesn't get to the root of the problem. We all know through the numerous hearings last year that one of the fundamental causes of the BP spill was a lack of not only enough inspectors, but a lack of inspectors with high levels of expertise and engineering knowledge. You wouldn't referee a game by doing away with the rules because the referee didn't know them. You get a better referee. If the department isn't to be going to given enough resources and expertise to do the job right and on time, the department shouldn't be forced to do the job too fast. We should be working to make government more efficient and more effective. My amendment addresses the root of this issue by lifting the arbitrary timeline requirements if the department isn't given the necessary resources it needs to properly process applications expeditiously. I urge a yes vote on my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Colorado, what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I will do my best to be brief. The purpose of H.R. 1229 is to get residents of the Gulf back to work producing offshore energy. Not only good for them, good for the entire country. This amendment, whether intended or not, would allow the administration to continue to impose a de facto moratorium that would delay American energy production and keep thousands of people out of work. The residents are simply in the Gulf are in a holding pattern, waiting for their jobs to come back. Some of them have even seen their jobs outsourced to other countries as rigs leave the Gulf of Mexico bound for other parts of the world. Now, there is an established process for the administration to propose and advocate for funding and resources different from what this amendment addresses. This annual process, the budget process, provides ample opportunity for considering what is needed to safely and responsibly oversee offshore energy production. Let us note that the House Republican majority, in enacting a budget, acted to increase funding for reviewing and approving offshore permits for the current year, which was not done by the Democratic Congress last year. This amendment would delay American energy production. For that reason, I oppose it. I urge my colleagues to vote no. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, on that I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado will be postponed.
This one first.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part A of House Report 112-73, on which further proceedings were postponed, in the following order. Amendment number 1 by Mr. Polis of Colorado. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Garamendi of California. Amendment number 3 by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts. The chair will reduce to 5 minutes the time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report 112-73 by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
I'm printed in Part A of House Report number 112-73, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is offered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House is voting on a few amendments to a bill that would expedite the permitting process on oil leases in the Gulf of Mexico. This first amendment would require a review of permits to consider current laws, including the Endangered Species Act. The larger bill is one of a series of measures supporters say are designed to increase offshore energy production. Here's more from a reporter covering energy issues. The House begins its work this week with two measures aimed at expediting and expanding oil drilling. Darren Samuelson is a senior energy and environment reporter at Politico. Why are they taking up these measures?
Gas prices, gas prices, gas prices. They seize a political opening to make the Democrats take some votes and show that they're trying to do something to reduce gas prices at the pump, as Americans pay, up to $4 a gallon around many parts of the country.
You mentioned, of course, gas prices. Supporters say that that'll reduce the price of gas at the pump. Is it true, and how would that work?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I don't know that a bill like this, if it were to be signed into law, could have an immediate effect at the pump. The Republicans certainly would tell you that. The gas prices are impacted by so many more things than just domestic production. World oil prices, sort of set the tone. Global stability or instability has a factor. Inflation, the price of the dollar, the strength of the economy. So there's a lot of things going on here, and whether or not you could point to this piece of legislation and say that it would lower prices by a penny or 10 cents is a little bit more complicated.
What are opponents saying about the measures?
Well, they're saying that the Republicans are pushing really fast to try and speed up oil and gas production at a time when attention should remain on the BP oil spill and what happened a year ago in the Gulf of Mexico, that the Interior Department has actually set up a number of safety precautions, and those should be allowed to be implemented, and that the Obama administration has been doing its job of reviewing the safety standards and the permitting that was going on in the Gulf at the other rigs that were drilling in deep water and shallow water. And that the permits have been going forward at a pretty good process and a good pace, whereas the Republicans are countering that these permits have been slow-walked ever since the spill.
Tell us more about the bill coming up on Wednesday, the one that calls for an expansion of oil drilling in the outer continental shelf.
Yeah, so the bill that is coming up, and the debate begins on Tuesday and spills over into Wednesday, would speed up the permitting process and actually put a permitting timeline of 60 days for the Interior Department to respond to new permits, and it would be a 30-day initial deadline, and then there would be 2 15-day extensions. And basically, that they say would kind of put as Ed Markey, the Democrat, actually said today, would put sort of an NBA shot clock on how much time the Interior Department has to say yes or no. And then it would also limit a number of other abilities for citizens to file lawsuits against the Interior Department when it dislikes these suits, and force those into the Fifth Circuit, which is down in the Louisiana-Texas region, which has shown to be quite sympathetic to the oil industry.
Republicans say the legislation would reverse President Obama's moratorium on offshore oil exploration, but Democrats say there is not a moratorium in place. Which is true?
It's a little bit harder to say than that. The moratorium idea has become a political football here for sure. The Democrats have approved, the Obama administration has approved going on about 50 shallow water permits here since lifting the moratorium that was in place after the spill, and another dozen or so deep water permits, and they say that there's only about 10 more that are waiting clearance. And so they've been moving forward at a pretty steady pace in terms of clearing the permits and clearing them with sort of the safety standards that the administration put into place after the spill as well.
Darren Samuelson is with Politico. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
While this vote continues, we'll hear from President Obama. He gave a speech about immigration today in El Paso, Texas, saying Republicans who wanted tougher border enforcement should now be ready to move forward on comprehensive immigration reform. The President and Democrats in the House are proposing legislation offering a pathway to citizenship to the nation's 11 million illegal immigrants, amid opposition from the majority Republicans in the House. Senator Durbin of Illinois plans to file a new DREAM Act bill tomorrow that would give young illegal immigrants a chance to live in the U.S. legally. And Representative Howard Berman of California plans to file similar legislation in the House. Here's the President from today talking about immigration.
Hello, El Paso. Well, it is wonderful, wonderful to be back with all of you in the Lone Star State. Everything's bigger in Texas. I love you back. Even the welcomes are bigger. So, in appreciation, I wanted to give a big policy speech outside on a really hot day. Those of you who are still wearing your jackets, feel free to take them off. I hope everybody's wearing sunscreen. Now, you say you live here, you don't need it, huh? Well, look, it is a great honor to be here, and I want to express my appreciation to all of you for taking the time to come out today. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. You know, about a week ago, I delivered a commencement address at Miami-Dade Community College, which is one of the most diverse schools in the nation. The graduates were proud that their class could claim heritage from 181 countries around the world. 181 countries. Many of the students were immigrants themselves, coming to America with little more than the dream of their parents and the clothes on their back. A handful had discovered, only in adolescence or adulthood, that they were undocumented. But they worked hard, and they gave it their all. And so they earned those diplomas. And at the ceremony, 181 flags, one for every nation that was represented, was marched across the stage. And each one was applauded by the graduates and the relatives with ties to those countries. So when the Haitian flag went by, all the Haitian kids, Haitian American kids, shouted out. And when the Guatemalan flag went by, all the kids of Guatemalan heritage shouted out. And when the Ukrainian flag went by, I think one kid shouted out. This was down in Miami. If it had been in Chicago, there would have been more. But then the last flag, the American flag, came into view. And everyone in the room erupted in applause. Everybody cheered. So, yes, their parents and grandparents, some of the graduates themselves, had come from every corner of the globe, but it was here that they had found opportunity. It was here that they had a chance to contribute to the nation that is their home. And it was a reminder of a simple idea as old as America itself. E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. We define ourselves as a nation of immigrants. A nation that welcomes those willing to embrace America's ideals and America's precepts. That's why millions of people, ancestors to most of us, braved hardship and great risk to come here. So they could be free to work and worship and start a business and live their lives in peace and prosperity. The Asian immigrants who made their way to California's Angel Island. The German and Scandinavians who settled across the Midwest. The waves of Irish and Italian and Polish and Russian and Jewish immigrants who leaned against the railing to catch their first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty. This flow of immigrants has helped make this country stronger and more prosperous. We can point to the genius of Einstein, the designs of IMP, the stories of Isaac Asimov, the entire industries that were forged by Andrew Carnegie. And then when I think about immigration, I think about the naturalization ceremonies that we've held at the White House for members of our military. Nothing could be more inspiring. Even though they were not yet citizens when they joined our military, these men and women signed up to serve. We did one event at the White House, and a young man named Granger Michael from Papua New Guinea, a Marine who had been deployed to Iraq 3 times, was there. And you know what he said about becoming an American citizen? He said, "I might as well. I love this country already." That's all he said. Marines aren't big on speeches. Another was a woman named Perla Ramos, who was born and raised in Mexico and came to the United States shortly after 9/11 and joined the Navy. And she said, "I take pride in our flag and the history we write day by day." That's the promise of this country, that anyone can write the next chapter in our story. It doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter what faith you worship. What matters is that you believe in the ideals on which we were founded, that you believe that all of us are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that all of us deserve our freedoms and our pursuit of happiness. In embracing America, you can become American. That is what makes this country great. That enriches all of us. And yet, at the same time, we're here at the border today because we also recognize that being a nation of laws goes hand in hand with being a nation of immigrants. This too is our heritage. This too is important. And the truth is, we've often wrestled with the politics of who is and who isn't allowed to come into this country. This debate is not new. At times, there's been fear and resentment directed towards newcomers, especially in hard economic times. And because these issues touch deeply on what we believe, touch deeply on our convictions about who we are as a people, about what it means to be an American, these debates often elicit strong emotions. That's one reason it's been so difficult to reform our broken immigration system. When an issue is this complex, when it raises such strong feelings, it's easier for politicians to defer the problem until the next election. And there's always a next election. So we've seen a lot of blame and a lot of politics and a lot of ugly rhetoric around immigration. And we've seen good faith efforts from leaders of both parties. By the way, I just noticed, you know, those of you who have chairs, if you want to sit down, feel free. You know, there's no rule about having to stand when I'm... Yeah. So... But we've seen leaders of both parties who tried to work on this issue, but then their efforts fell prey to the usual Washington games. And all the while, we've seen the mounting consequences of decades of inaction. Today, there are an estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants here in the United States. Some cross the border illegally. Others avoid immigration laws by overstaying their visas. Regardless of how they came, the overwhelming majority of these folks are just trying to earn a living and provide for their families. But we have to acknowledge they've broken the rules. They've cut in front of the line. And what is also true is that the presence of so many illegal immigrants makes a mockery of all those who are trying to immigrate legally. Also, because undocumented immigrants live in the shadows, where they're vulnerable to unscrupulous businesses that skirt taxes and pay workers less than the minimum wage or cut corners with health and safety laws. This puts companies who follow the rules and Americans who rightly demand the minimum wage or overtime or just a safe place to work, it puts those businesses at a disadvantage. Think about it. Over the past decade, even before the recession hit, middle-class families were struggling to get by as the costs went up for everything from health care to college tuition to groceries to gas. Their incomes didn't go up with those prices. We're seeing it again right now with gas prices. So one way to strengthen the middle class in America is to reform the immigration system so that there's no longer a massive underground economy that exploits a cheap source of labor while depressing wages for everybody else. I want incomes for middle-class families to rise again. I want prosperity in this country to be widely shared. I want everybody to be able to reach that American dream, and that's why immigration reform is an economic imperative. It's an economic imperative. And reform will also help to make America more competitive in the global economy. Now, today we provide students from around the world with visas to get engineering and computer science degrees at our top universities. But then our laws discourage them from using those skills to start a business or a new industry here in the United States. Instead of training entrepreneurs to stay here, we train them to create jobs for our competition. That makes no sense. In a global marketplace, we need all the talent we can attract, all the talent we can get to stay here, to start businesses, not just to benefit those individuals, but because their contribution will benefit all Americans. Look at Intel, look at Google, look at Yahoo, look at eBay. All
On
those
this
great
vote,
American companies.
the yeas are 167, the nays are
240.
245. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 2, printed in Part A of House Report 112-73 by the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, on which further proceedings were postponed, on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report number 112-73, offered by Mr. Garamendi of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of a request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
Members are voting now on an amendment that would implement the BP Oil Spill Commission's recommendation by requiring that in reviewing a drilling permit, the Interior Secretary would consult with an independent drilling safety organization and not affiliated with the American Petroleum Institute. One more vote after this one. President Obama's speech in El Paso, Texas followed a visit to the border. As we continue to watch as much as we can of the President during this vote, I wanted you to know that you can see all the President's remarks after the House is out tonight here on C-SPAN and anytime at cspan.org.
Look at Intel, look at Google, look at Yahoo, look at eBay. All those great American companies, all the jobs they've created, everything that has helped us take leadership in the high-tech industry, every one of those was founded by, guess who? An immigrant. So we don't want the next Intel or the next Google to be created in China or India. We want those companies and jobs to take root here. Now, Bill Gates gets this. He knows a little something about the high-tech industry. He said, the United States will find it far more difficult to maintain its competitive edge if it excludes those who are able and willing to help us compete. So immigration is not just the right thing to do, it's smart for our economy. It's smart for our economy. And it's for this reason that businesses all across America are demanding that Washington finally meet its responsibilities to solve the immigration problem. Everybody recognizes the system's broken. The question is, will we finally summon the political will to do something about it? And that's why we're here at the border today. And I want to say, I am joined today by an outstanding secretary. I am joined today by an outstanding secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, who's been working tirelessly on this issue. Our commissioner, who's working diligently on border issues, Alan Breslin, is here, and we appreciate him. Burson. So they're doing outstanding work, and in recent years, among one of the greatest impediments to reform were questions about border security. And these were legitimate concerns. What was true was a lack of manpower and a lack of resources at the border, combined with the pull of jobs and ill-considered enforcement once folks were in the country. All this contributed to a growing number of undocumented people living in the United States. And these concerns helped unravel a bipartisan coalition that we had forged back when I was in the United States Senate. So in the years since, borders first. Borders first. That's become the common refrain, even among those who were previously supportive of comprehensive immigration reform. But over the last 2 years, thanks to the outstanding work of Janet and Alan and everybody who's down here working at the border, we've answered those concerns. Under their leadership, we have strengthened border security beyond what many believed was possible. They wanted more agents at the border. Well, we now have more boots on the ground on the southwest border than at any time in our history. The Border Patrol has 20,000 agents. The Border Patrol has 20,000 agents, more than twice as many as there were in 2004. There's a buildup that began under President Bush and that we've continued. And I had a chance to meet some of these outstanding agents and actually saw some of them on horseback who looked pretty tough. So we put the agents here. Then they wanted a fence. Well, the fence is now basically complete. Then we've gone further. We tripled the number of intelligence analysts working at the border. I've deployed unmanned aerial vehicles to patrol the skies from Texas to California. We have forged a partnership with Mexico to fight the transnational criminal organizations that have affected both of our countries. And for the first time, we're screening 100% of southbound rail shipments to seize guns and money going south, even as we go after drugs that are coming north. So here's the point. I want everybody to listen carefully to this. We have gone above and beyond what was requested by the very Republicans who said they supported broader reform as long as we got serious about enforcement. All the stuff they asked for, we've done. But even though we've answered these concerns, I've got to say I suspect there's still going to be some who are trying to move the goalposts on us. One more time.
59. The nays are 240.
Border Patrol.
The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of House Report 112-73 by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by a voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112.